The grand ballroom of the Vintage Hotel was alive with energy as the Agatha Christie fan convention unfolded. Fans, young and old, swirled in colorful costumes, paying homage to the iconic characters of Poirot, Miss Marple, and other famous figures from Christie's novels. A giant banner hung overhead, declaring the event's theme, "The Mystery of Christie's Unpublished Masterpiece." The excitement was palpable. This convention was not just any gathering, but a celebration of a rare and elusive prize, a rumored lost manuscript, Christie's final, unfinished story. At the center of the room was an elaborate display case, encasing the manuscript in a secure glass box, its pages never before seen by the public. It was said to contain the key to solving one of the greatest mysteries in literary history, final piece of a puzzle no one could ever have predicted. The whispers were electric. What would it reveal? Would it change the world of detective fiction forever? But no one knew that the true mystery was about to unfold right in front of them. The noise from the crowd became almost deafening. People laughed, debated, and posed for pictures, but there was one person in the crowd who was silent, a shadow in the corner. Cloaked in a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat, their face hidden in the shadows of the chandelier's flickering light, they lingered near the display case. A hand, gloved and quick, reached out and delicately tampered with the lock just enough to cause suspicion without being noticed. Minutes passed. The crowd remained oblivious to the sinister act taking place just beyond their line of sight. The evening carried on, guests enjoying the exhibits and mingling over glasses of champagne. But as the night drew on, the atmosphere began to shift, though no one realized it yet. The clock struck midnight. In the early hours of the morning, the Grand Hotel was cloaked in silence, broken only by the occasional footstep of a staff member and the quiet hum of distant conversations. Then, a scream shattered the quiet. The manuscript was gone. The entire event came to a halt when the shocking discovery was made. The glass case had been opened, the manuscript stolen, and the thief was nowhere to be found. As panic spread through the hotel, a grim discovery was made in one of the suites. The body of a famous mystery author attending the convention as a guest was found, sprawled across their bed, lifeless. But the scene was not just tragic, it was eerie. A playing card, the Queen of Spades, was delicately placed on the victim's chest. The card seemed to mock the very idea of the Mysterian enigma on top of an enigma. The authorities rushed to the scene, but the question loomed larger than ever. Who had stolen the manuscript, and what was the significance of the Queen of Spades? As the first detective entered the room, his mind already racing with questions, the air in the hotel thickened with tension. What connection did the playing card have to the murder? Was the manuscript connected to the death, or was something darker at play? And most chilling of all, could the thief be someone in the crowd? The mystery was just beginning, but who would solve it first? The chase was on, and the danger had only just begun. Cliffhanger. The detective bent over the body, his gaze locked on the Queen of Spades card. His voice was barely a whisper. A game is about to begin, and the stakes have never been higher. 2. The characters. The ensemble cast. The investigation into the theft of the manuscript revealed a cast of characters, each with their own secrets, desires, and motives. As the case unfolded, it became clear that no one was without a dark side, and every motive seemed to pull in a different direction. Edward Sterling. Edward Sterling was pacing back and forth in the corner of the hotel lobby, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd. He was a seasoned Christie scholar, his passion for the author bordering on obsession, his glasses perched on the end of his nose, his fingers twitching nervously at the edges of his shirt sleeves. Edward's obsession wasn't just with Christie's works, though. It was with a family secret, a secret he believed the lost manuscript contained. "I know it's in there," he muttered under his breath, his voice tight with emotion. "Christie uncovered something about my family. She knew. I swear she knew." His words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, There was a flicker of something dark in his eyes. Was it hope? Or something more sinister? He clenched his jaw, clearly holding something back, as if revealing too much might ruin his chances of finding the manuscript. Cliffhanger. Edward's voice dropped to a low whisper, as if speaking to no one in particular. If I find it, I will expose them. They won't hide forever. Clara Withers. Clara Withers stood near the bar, her eyes scanning the room like a hawk, picking out every angle, every conversation. She was a journalist, ambitious, driven, and willing to do anything for the career-making story that had eluded her for years. Tonight, she was determined to make that story hers. Everyone here is obsessed with Christie, but I am here to uncover the real story, Clara said, her voice sharp, almost biting. She took a sip of her champagne, barely noticing the way the glass trembled slightly in her hand. It was clear to anyone watching that Clara wasn't just there to enjoy the convention. She was there for something much bigger. And as she continued to chat with various attendees, she'd throw out just enough hints about a scandal she was investigating, too calculated for comfort. Cliffhanger. As Clara caught sight of Edward's frantic pacing, she grinned slightly. Maybe the manuscript isn't the only thing worth stealing, she whispered to herself. Lila Gray. Lila Gray was the hotel's quiet librariana woman, whose presence often went unnoticed. She had always been a devoted fan of Christie, and it was no surprise that she knew every detail about the manuscript display. Still, there was something unsettling about Lila. She had a peculiar habit of sketching people when nervous, and her notepad was full of quick, almost frantic sketches of the guests. "You are sure you are all right, Lila?" a colleague asked her, noticing the dark circles under her eyes. Lila barely looked up. "I am fine," she replied softly, the lines on her face growing deeper as she fixed her attention on the exhibit. But her hands were trembling. She had spent countless hours with the manuscript, carefully studying it for a detail that might tie it to the mysteries she'd been obsessing over for years. Her quiet, reserved demeanor hid a mind that was constantly at work calculating, observing, and waiting. Cliffhanger. Lila's eyes darted nervously to the back of the room. "It was never supposed to be this way," she muttered. "It was never supposed to be this dangerous." Dr. James Palmer. Dr. James Palmer was an enigmatic, figure-charming, charismatic, but always with a shadow over him. A respected auctioneer, he was known for his ability to secure rare items for his clients. But there was something off about him, something people couldn't quite place. His smile was too smooth, his handshake too firm. He was the type of man who'd offer a drink with a smile, but you'd always wonder if he had an agenda. "I was simply interested in acquiring it," he told a curious attendee, his voice smooth as velvet. "The manuscript, of course. You know how these things go, exclusive and expensive." But his eyes gave him away. The slightest glint of something far less innocent greed, perhaps? A need for control? It was as if Dr. Palmer wasn't just interested in the manuscript. He was obsessed with owning it. Cliffhanger. Later that evening, Dr. Palmer stood in the shadow of a nearby pillar, his eyes narrowing as he watched the chaos unfold. His lips curled into a smile. "Let them chase their tails," he murmured. "But I will get what's mine." 3. Rising tension. The investigation begins. The morning after the crime, the once festive hotel had transformed. The grand ballroom, filled with laughter and chatter just hours before, was now eerily quiet. The only sound that broke the silence was the soft shuffle of footsteps as the police began their investigation. But there was one presence among the crowd that stood out, calm, collected, and unflustered by the chaos. Captain Harold Withers, a retired detective and a well-known Christie enthusiast, stood in the middle of the hotel lobby, his sharp eyes taking in every detail with practiced ease. He had been summoned by the convention organizers to solve the case discreetly. They needed a detective who understood the gravity of the situation, but more importantly, someone who wouldn't escalate the panic that had already gripped the attendees. As he made his way through the hotel, people paused to watch him. He was tall, with a neatly trimmed beard, a confident gait, and an air of authority that seemed to put others at ease. Captain Withers exuded a quiet charm, an old-world gentleman who didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. His reputation preceded him, both as a retired detective and as someone who shared a deep admiration for Agatha Christie's works. The connection was immediate. He had solved his fair share of cases, but he'd always made time for Christie's mysteries, drawn to their intricacies. A reporter approached him with a nervous smile, her camera slung around her neck. "Captain Withers," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "what do you think happened here?" He glanced at her for a moment, giving her a smile that was both kind and slightly amused. "Well, my dear, it seems we have a murder on our hands, doesn't it?" His words were simple, yet they carried a weight. They weren't a statement of surprise, but an acknowledgement of the obvious. He paused, his gaze shifting to the playing card left on the victim's chest, the Queen of Spades. His eyes narrowed just slightly, studying the card. Then, without a word, he turned on his heel and walked toward the scene of the crime. The crowd parted as he passed, but no one dared approach. His calm demeanor made people uneasy, as if they knew he saw through every hidden detail that everyone else overlooked. Inside the victim's suite, Captain Withers took in the scene, allowing his eyes to linger on the room's subtle clues. There were no dramatic signs of struggle, nothing that screamed violence, but the arrangement of the body told its own story. The playing card, the victim's open notebook, with scribbled notes, everything was placed just so, as if someone had orchestrated it with meticulous care. He crouched near the body, his hand hovering over the Queen of Spades card. The faintest crease of a smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "A game, then," he murmured under his breath, almost as though talking to the card itself. "But what's the play?" He stood up slowly, turning to examine the rest of the room. His sharp eyes were like a scalpel, cutting through the distractions of the scene. The desk, the bed, the window, everything was being catalogued in his mind. The victim's notebook, filled with cryptic notes that seemed to mimic Christie's own writing style, was the most intriguing. Was it an imitation, or had the victim known something? A riddle left in plain sight. One of the officers, visibly on edge, spoke up. "We've already spoken to the suspects, sir, but—" Captain Withers held up a hand to stop him. "I'll talk to them in due time, but first—" He paused, turning his gaze to the window where the early morning light filtered through the blinds. He was piecing it together in silence, his mind working as the tension in the room grew thicker. There was something about the way the room had been left untouched. It felt familiar. A little too familiar. After a moment of silence, he gave a small nod. "I am going to need a bit more time to figure out the game here." His voice was calm, but there was an underlying intensity in it. The kind of intensity that suggested he already knew things the others hadn't even begun to consider. Cliffhanger. As he turned to leave, his eyes flicked back to the playing card one last time, and the faintest glimmer of realization crossed his face. He said nothing, but there was a look in his eye zone that held a promise of danger, of secrets about to be uncovered. Before stepping out, he muttered softly to himself, "It's never as simple as it seems, not with a Christie mystery." And with that, the door clicked shut behind him. What he knew, no one else could guess. Clues emerged from the scene. Captain Harold Withers stood in the middle of the victim's suite, the silence thick with the weight of the crime. The room, bathed in the early morning light, seemed to hold its breath, as though it too were waiting for the detective to unlock its secrets. His sharp eyes moved methodically across the room, taking in every detail, each clue, each subtle hint that might offer a glimpse of the truth. His gaze first settled on the playing card, still resting on the victim's chest, the Queen of Spades. It was impossible to ignore its presence, it almost seemed too deliberate. The card, pristine and unmoving, was the centerpiece of the crime scene, not just a symbol of death, but something more. Something intentional. Withers crouched down, his fingers brushing the edge of the card. He felt its smooth surface, as though it were alive with meaning. The Queen of Spades, he murmured under his breath, his voice thoughtful. A symbol of mystery and deception, or is it something more? His mind raced with the possibilities. Was this a message? In Christie's novels, the Queen of Spades had always been more than a mere card. It had carried weight, like the ominous promise of an unraveling truth. A slight shiver ran through him as he carefully examined the rest of the scene. The body, lifeless but perfectly positioned, spoke volumes. Nothing about it felt hurried or chaotic. It was deliberate, planned. But why the card? Why this card? His attention shifted then to the notebook, the victim's notebook, lying open on the desk, half hidden beneath a stack of papers. It had caught his eye earlier, but now it demanded closer scrutiny. Withers picked it up, flipping through the pages one by one. The notes were jumbled, messy, but something about them felt familiar. There were strange scribbles, odd phrases, fragments of sentences that looked like they had been hastily written down in the middle of a frantic thought process. It wasn't until he reached the last page that his heart skipped a beat. A line of text crude, scrawled in a hurried hand, seemed to leap off the page. The final clue lies within the twist of the Queen's hand. Withers froze. The words made no sense, yet they were impossibly specific. The twist of the Queen's hand. Was it referring to the playing card, or something more? He couldn't shake the feeling that this was a piece of the puzzle, but it was incompleted deliberately so. Whoever had written it wanted him to find it, wanted him to follow this breadcrumb. But why? The words seemed to haunt him. The connection between the Queen of Spades and this cryptic message seemed too strong to ignore. Was the victim trying to solve something, or was this an attempt to reveal a hidden truth? The possibility that this was more than just a murder it was a carefully crafted puzzle began to weigh on him. As he stood there, lost in thought, his eyes wandered back to the window. The pale sunlight creeping through the blinds cast long shadows across the room, as if time itself was trying to obscure the truth. But then, something caught his attention, something that had been there all along, but now seemed to pulse with a new significance. The victim's desk was positioned in a way that made it almost impossible for anyone to sit at it without being in full view of the window. But there was one corner, just out of sight, where a torn piece of paper was wedged between the desk and the wall. Withers moved swiftly, pulling it free. It was a fragment of an old, well-worn book cover that looked strikingly familiar. The edges were frayed, the print barely visible. But it was enough for him to recognize it. It was from one of Agatha Christie's lesser-known works, a novel long out of print and hardly ever mentioned. Why would a piece of this book be here? He ran his fingers over the torn edges, and it clicked in his mind. This wasn't just a clue, it was a warning. Whoever had done this wanted him to remember Christie's work. They wanted him to understand the deeper meaning behind this crime. And it was something far bigger than he had anticipated. Cliffhanger. Captain Withers stood motionless, the torn piece of paper clenched in his hand. His heart raced. He had uncovered the first layer, but the more he uncovered, the deeper the rabbit hole seemed to go. He glanced once more at the Queen of Spades, the cryptic note, and the fragment of Christie's book, all pointing to something that he wasn't sure he was ready to find. With a deep breath, he muttered to himself. This was never about just a stolen manuscript. This was about something much darker. Something someone is willing to kill for. As he turned to leave the room, the shadows grew longer, and the door creaked shut behind him, leaving only more questions in the wake of his departure. Climax. The reveal. The hotel library was eerily quiet, a perfect contrast to the chaos that had unfolded in the past few days. The air was thick with anticipation as Captain Harold Withers stood at the center of the room, his back to the crackling fireplace, its flames flickering like the last remnants of a dying mystery. The four suspects, Edward Sterling, Clara Withers, Lila Gray, and Dr. James Palmer, were seated in front of him, their faces a mixture of apprehension and defiance. Each of them knew that the game was over. The truth was about to be revealed. Withers, calm and composed, had spent days piecing together the scattered puzzle of motives and lies. Now, with the final pieces in place, he was ready to expose the dark web that had entangled them all. The suspects fidgeted, their eyes darting nervously between one another, their every move speaking volumes. Edward Sterling was the first to look away, his jaw tight, his hands folded in front of him. He had been a man of conviction when he arrived, but now his arrogance had faded into unease. Lila Gray sat still, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of her book as she avoided meeting anyone's gaze. Clara Withers, ever the journalist, held her head high, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. And Dr. James Palmer, the auctioneer, exuded an air of charm, yet his lips were thin, and his posture stiff, defensive, yet calculating. Captain Withers cleared his throat, breaking the tense silence. "You've all been more than willing to hide the truth," he began, his voice steady but laced with the weight of the investigation. "But no more. The time for secrets is over." He looked at each suspect, his gaze unwavering. "We begin with you, Edward Sterling. You came to this convention for more than just the love of Christie's work, didn't you? You believed that this lost manuscript contained a clue to a family secret, a secret that Christie had uncovered about your ancestors. That's why you tried to steal it, but you didn't kill the victim." Edward's eyes flickered, his face betraying a flicker of guilt. He opened his mouth, but Withers silenced him with a raised hand. "Clara Withers," he continued, turning toward the journalist, "you were desperate for a career, defining scoop, willing to do anything to get it, including blackmailing the victim. But your greed didn't lead to murder. No, you were too obvious." Clara's cheeks flushed with a mix of humiliation and anger, but she stayed silent. Her shoulders tensed, and she gritted her teeth, knowing the detective was right. Withers' gaze shifted to Lila Gray, the quiet librarian whose calm demeanor had always seemed a bit too perfect. "Lila, you know Christie's work better than anyone in this room, but when the manuscript was stolen, you didn't panic. You knew it was a forgery before any of us did. That's why you tried to frame the other Stowe, protect Christie's legacy. You even used her own methods, red herrings, misdirection to create the perfect crime. But you went too far, and that's where you made your mistake." Lila's face paled as the detective's words sank in. She tried to steady her breathing, but it was clear she had underestimated Withers. Finally, Withers turned his attention to Dr. James Palmer, the auctioneer who had been the most elusive of them all. "Dr. Palmer, you knew the manuscript was a forgery before anyone else. You were willing to purchase it for an anonymous client. But when you learned of its true nature, you tried to cover it up. You didn't want anyone to know that the manuscript was fake. So, you made sure the victim was silenced." Dr. Palmer stiffened, his gaze faltering for just a moment before he recovered his usual composure. "I didn't kill anyone," he said, his voice cold and controlled. "You are making a mistake." Withers shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "No, Dr. Palmer, you just thought you could outsmart the rest of us, but you couldn't." The room was charged with tension as the detective placed the final piece of the puzzle in front of them all. "The real killer," Withers said, his voice low and deliberate, "is someone who never wanted the manuscript to see the light of day. Someone who wanted to protect the integrity of Christie's legacy, even if it meant taking drastic measures. And that person is—" The room held its breath. Withers let the pause linger, his gaze settling on Lila Gray, the librarian who had spent her life in the shadows of Christie's world. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and resignation, her fingers gripping the edge of the armchair as if trying to hold on to the last remnants of her composure. "The true culprit is you, Lila," he said, his voice final. "You knew the manuscript was a forgery from the start. You manipulated everyone here, using Christie's technique, red herrings, Her tricks, her misdirection to confuse us, to deflect suspicion. You were willing to kill to keep the truth hidden. And in the end, you didn't just steal. The manuscript, you stole a piece of Christie's soul. Lila's face drained of color as the weight of the revelation settled over her. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words never came. She was caught, and she knew it. Cliffhanger. Withers took a slow, deliberate step forward, his gaze never leaving Lila. But this doesn't end here. The story, your story, is far from over. The finality of his words echoed through the library, the flames from the fireplace crackling in the silence. As the suspects sat frozen in shock, Withers's mind began to race. There was something more to this than he could explain, something deeper, something even darker. And as the door to the library creaked open, he turned toward it, sensing that the real game was just about to begin. The room seemed to close in around Lila Gray, the librarian whose calm exterior had concealed a mind sharpened by obsession. With every word Captain Withers spoke, the truth unraveled before her like a tightly wound thread, each tug pulling her deeper into the web of her own making. Lila had always been an ardent admirer of Agatha Christie. Her admiration wasn't just for the stories themselves, but for the meticulous crafting of every plot, every twist, and every character. Christie's genius lay in her ability to mislead, to keep the reader guessing, to make even the most innocent detail feel ominous. Lila had studied those techniques for years, immersing herself in the patterns and rhythms of Christie's work. But it wasn't just admiration. It was a deep-seated belief that Christie's legacy had to be protected at all costs. The manuscript, the so-called lost one, had been her obsession. At first, she had believed in its authenticity, the promise that it could complete Christie's already legendary body of work. But as the days passed and the puzzle pieces started to fall into place, Lila had realized the awful truth. It was a forgery. The manuscript wasn't the final work of Agatha Christie. It was a cheap imitation, a mockery of the brilliance that had made Christie's books timeless. Lila couldn't let it be published. She couldn't let it tarnish the memory of the woman who had given her, and so many others, a lifetime of mystery and intrigue. And so, the plan had begun to form just like one of Christie's novels. She had known from the start that she would have to control the narrative, to manipulate the situation so that no one would see the truth until it was too late. The theft of the manuscript? A diversion. The murder of the mystery author? An unfortunate consequence. The Queen of Spades, the playing card left on the victim's chest? That was just a clue, a symbol, something to keep the investigation spinning in circles. Every detail, every twist, every turn in the investigation had been a carefully placed piece on her chessboard. Lila had used Christie's storytelling techniques like a seasoned novelist. She planted red herrings, little clues designed to mislead and misdirect, to lead Captain Withers down a false trail. Edward Sterling's obsession with the manuscript and his ancestral ties to Christie's work had given him the perfect cover as the prime suspect. Clara Withers's blackmail attempt had been the perfect distraction after all. Who wouldn't believe the journalist was capable of such a crime? Even Dr. Palmer, with his shady auction dealings, had seemed like a reasonable threat. But none of them had been the real culprit. Lila had orchestrated it all, pulling the strings from the shadows. Her greatest misstep, however, had been underestimating Captain Withers. The detective's mind, sharp and methodical, had seen through the web of deception. He had recognized the pattern. He had understood that this wasn't just a case of theft or murder. It was a puzzle, a twisted game of misdirection. And in the end, Lila had been caught in her own trap. Her heart raced as she stood before Captain Withers, her carefully crafted world falling apart around her. She could feel the weight of the accusation hanging in the air, heavy with the finality of the truth. But there was no denying it now. She had killed to protect what she loved most. She had killed to protect Christie's legacy from being tainted by a lie. Withers stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "You didn't just steal the manuscript, Lila," he said, his voice cold but not unkind. "You killed to protect it, to protect her legacy." Lila swallowed hard, her throat dry. She had no defense, no excuse. She had done it because she believed it was the right thing to do, because she was certain that the world couldn't handle the truth of the forgery. Christie's work had to remain untainted. She had done what any true fan would dosh, had safeguarded the memory of the woman who had shaped her life. But now, standing here, facing the consequences of her actions, Lila realized the truth. She had allowed her obsession to overshadow everything else. She had become the very thing she had feared someone willing to destroy, to protect something that wasn't truly hers. Withers' gaze softened for a moment, but his voice remained firm. "In the end, Lila, you are no different than the very criminals Christie wrote about, the ones who believed the ends justified the means." Lila's hands trembled, and she could feel the tears welling up behind her eyes. But she couldn't look away. She had been caught, and no amount of Christie's clever tricks or misdirection could save her now. Her fate was sealed. Cliffhanger. But as she was led out of the room, a strange thought crossed her mind. Had Captain Withers uncovered all of the secrets? Was this truly the end, or was there more to this story than anyone realized? She couldn't shake the feeling that the game wasn't finished yet, that something darker, something deeper, was waiting just around the corner. The cold, sterile walls of the police station were a far cry from the warmth of the hotel library, where the tangled web of deceit had unraveled. Lila Gray, the quiet librarian, the devoted Christie fan, sat in the interrogation room, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression calm but eyes distant, as though she were already somewhere else, somewhere beyond the consequences of her actions. The truth had come crashing down on her, and now there was no more denying it. She had taken the life of a man, shattered the lives of many, all to protect what she believed was a sacred piece of literature, a manuscript that could never see the light of day, at least, not in its tainted form. But in the aftermath, as the weight of the revelation settled in, something else lingered in the air. Something darker. As the detectives prepared to take her away, Lila looked up, her eyes meeting Captain Withers's once more. There was no fear in her gaze, no regret. Instead, there was a strange calm, a quiet certainty, like a final chapter in a book she had already written in her mind. "Christie would have admired me," she said softly, the words slipping from her lips like a confession. But it wasn't remorse. It was something else, pride, maybe, or an eerie sense of justification. Captain Withers didn't respond right away. He simply stared at her, a mix of pity and understanding crossing his features. "Perhaps," he said finally, his voice quiet. "But in the end, Lila, you became the villain of your own story." The words echoed in the empty room long after she was led away. Her fate was sealed, but the ripples of her actions would be felt for a long time to come. As the detectives moved to gather the final evidence from her hotel suite, something was uncovered that only added to the eerie sense of finality that now hung in the air. The manuscript, the one everyone had believed was lost forever, wasn't lost at all. It had been hiding in plain sight, a secret so cleverly concealed that no one had suspected it for a second. As the officers sifted through the piles of books in the hotel's library, one particularly old, leather-bound tome caught their attention. The cover was faded and cracked, as though it had been untouched for years. But as they opened it, a thin, brittle sheet of paper slipped out, a manuscript page, yellowed with age, the ink still sharp and unmistakably Christie's. The real manuscript, the one that had been hidden all along, was now in their hands. And it was perfect, flawless, a tribute to the master herself, her wit, her precision, her love for puzzles. The detectives couldn't help but pause, the irony of it all sinking in. The manuscript Lila had killed to protect was never in danger of being released. It had simply been a part of the puzzle, another layer of the mystery, hidden as cleverly as any Christie novel's final twist. As they placed the manuscript back inside the hotel's secure vault, the room seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. as if the lingering tension had finally been exhaled. But the questions remained. What did Lila's obsession truly mean? What drove her to sacrifice everything, including her own sanity, in the name of preserving a single piece of art? Cliffhanger. But as the vault door clanged shut, Captain Withers lingered for a moment, his eyes drifting to the manuscript resting behind glass. He couldn't shake the feeling that something about this whole case wasn't over, that somehow, somewhere, the final chapter hadn't yet been written. Lila had been only one piece of the puzzle. But who had set it all into motion? Who had known that the manuscript was a forgery before Lila did? And more importantly, who was still out there, watching, waiting for the next chapter to unfold? The detective turned, a sense of unease crawling up his spine. The case might have been closed, but the story was far from over. Captain Harold stood alone in the hotel's dimly lit hallway, the echoes of footsteps fading as the last of the detectives departed. The weight of the case had settled heavily on his shoulders, but it was more than the exhaustion of solving a murder. It was something deeper, something more unsettling. His mind replayed the events of the past days, the web of lies, deceptions, and manipulations that had woven themselves so intricately around him. Lila Gray, her chilling words echoing in his mind, still lingered. Christie would have admired me. The detective leaned against the cool stone wall, his gaze drifting out the tall window toward the darkening sky. The stars above, distant and indifferent, seemed to mock the complexities of the world below. What was it about mysteries that drew people in so completely, he thought. The human fascination with the unknown was a constant puzzle in itself. People were captivated by stories that made them question reality, stories that pulled them into worlds of intrigue and deception, where nothing was ever quite as it seemed. It was no different with Lila. She had allowed herself to be consumed by the mystery of the manuscript, so much so that she'd become a part of her own twisted narrative, a narrative where the lines between fiction and reality blurred until they became one. Was it possible, he wondered, that all of them, the suspects, the victims, even himself, had been drawn into a kind of story of their own making? Lila had manipulated the situation, as though it were a Christie novel, constructing clues, creating misdirection, and playing her part to perfection. But why? What made her believe she could rewrite the ending of her own life to match the perfect mystery she adored? Captain Harold had seen his share of dark motives over the years: greed, jealousy, revenge, but what he had witnessed with Lila was something different, something obsessive. It was as if she saw herself as the heroine of a grand tale, and the truth had become an obstacle to her version of reality. In her mind, her actions were justified. She was merely following the script of a perfect mystery. He sighed, the weight of his thoughts pressing in on him. Maybe that's what fascinated people so much about mystery, as their ability to strip away the masks of everyday life, revealing something raw and honest. In a world full of hidden motives and half-truths, mysteries held the power to expose the truth, to force people to confront their darkest selves. But in doing so, it also blurred the line between what was real and what was imagined. The truth, he realized, was just as elusive as the mysteries themselves. It was never as neat, never as tidy, and never as simple as people wanted it to be. The answers, when they came, were always a little more complicated than anyone anticipated. And sometimes, in the pursuit of the truth, the search itself became the greatest mystery of all. With a final glance at the distant skyline, Captain Harold stood up, his thoughts swirling like the smoke from a pipe. He knew the case was over. But his mind couldn't let go of the bigger question, the question that lingered in the back of every mystery lover's mind. Was it the stories we told that shaped reality? Or was it reality that shaped the stories we told? He took one last look at the quiet hotel before stepping out into the night. The world was full of mysteries waiting to be solved, but this one, this case, had left its mark. And as he walked away, a thought lingered in his mind, unanswered and haunting. What if there were no true endings? What if the story never really ended at all?